It was the evening of Boxing Day, and 19-year-old Katy Briscoe was at her sister's house babysitting her niece and nephew.
She totally doted on them. They were her world, they were her life, and that was just the end of it.
But just after 9 p.m, there was a knock on the door.
It was obvious to us that whoever came to the door that evening was somebody that Katy knew and was comfortable with letting into her sister's house.
But by opening the door, Katy welcomed in a nightmare.
That night was the beginning of an ordeal. I wasn't prepared to believe it was real because it just didn't make any sense.
The police investigation into the horror unleashed on that Boxing Day night revealed Katy had become ensnared in a twisted virtual world.
It was a complex web of deceit, but the more we investigated, the more we realised that it was just a sick and twisted fantasy.
An evil social network where no one was what they seemed and no one could be trusted.
Nobody should die that way.
I've never seen anything that horrific.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
Boreham Wood in South Hertfordshire has been called the British Hollywood because of its proximity to Elstree Studios. It was also the town Joy Briscoe made home in 1994 when she moved from London with her two daughters, 13-year-old Sabrina and Katy, who was just 1.5.
You could say some people go up and down. Katy was just one straight line. The same humble, quiet, peaceful-natured person. Katy has never ever once said to me, I do not like this person or I found faults with this person. She was always jolly, cheerful and happy. Katy was never interested in going to clubs, smoking or drinking or even putting on makeup.
She was just interested in studying, church and family.
"7 days passed after the Lord struck the river. Then the Lord..."
From a young age, Katy became involved with the local church.
Oh, everybody loved Katy. She was a dear, dear soul. She would come into the church on a Sunday morning with a big smile. She would sit down on the back row of the back pew with other teenage girls in the congregation. Everybody loved her. She was a dear girl.
In 2007, when Katy was 15, she became an auntie for the first time to a baby girl. And the following year, her nephew was born.
She always wanted to be around them. There wouldn't be a day where she probably wouldn't see them or want to babysit them. Even if I was there, she'd just be there.
I think it's because she didn't want us to be fussing over her as the youngest anymore. So she took it in her stride.
As well as being a devoted auntie, Katy had a creative talent and passion. She was a gifted artist.
Oh, she was forever drawing sketches. In actual fact, on your birthday, she would say, I'll draw you something because I'm putting my personal touches to this. And she draws a sketch of something that she thought about that suited us.
She always was drawing, and she expressed herself through her work.
After passing her GCSEs in 2008, Katy enrolled at West Herts College in Watford to transform her artistic talent into a career.
She was very dedicated, very motivated in what she wanted to do. So she really did excel in college.
Katy initially studied a 2-year BTEC National Diploma in Art and Design, and in 2010 she started a foundation degree in graphic design and illustration. At college, she met a teenager called Tony Bushby.
I'm sorry.
Tony Bushby was an 18-year-old male who'd started college in 2009, studying a BTEC in art and design, but specialising in graphics. Katy and Tony weren't on the same course, although they were studying similar subjects and therefore, we believe, would have seen and bumped into each other on a regular basis at college. And as is often the case in today's society, as well as being friends at college, they were also friends through the social networking site Facebook.
And it was through this social network that their relationship developed. In spring 2011, via Facebook, Tony asked Katy out on an official date.
Katy, I was wondering if sometime you maybe wanted to go to the cinema with me.
We believe that Tony and Katy went on their first date in April of 2011 when they went to the cinema together.
Katy and Tony's relationship continued to develop, but the couple kept it secret.
Well, I'll see you at college tomorrow, OK?
Okay.
One last thing. Let's keep it between me and you.
Katy's friends said that she was quite secretive about the relationship with Tony, but if they actually asked her directly how things were going, she would just say it was fine.
I never really 100% knew that Katy had a boyfriend. At night, sometimes I'd have girly chats with her and just be like, Katy, like, do you have a boyfriend? She'd be like, no. And then there was other times where I'd be like, Katy, I know you've got a boyfriend. She'd just snigger it off. Wasn't sure whether she felt uncomfortable about speaking about it or whether she was just being a teenager.
And through her relationship with Tony Bushby, Katy found she was making new friends online. People Tony knew began to send her friend requests on Facebook.
One by one, during mid to late 2011, Katy was approached via messages from 4 people who said they were friends with Tony Bushby. These 4 friends were called Dan Tress, Sin or Cynthia Darwin, Shane Pluon and Crystal Stangard. And they all added her as a friend and asked her if she was the person he'd been going out with.
And we know that Tony, Katy and those 4 people all participated in conversations via Facebook.
Through Tony, Katy now had a new circle of friends.
In reality, she had never met any of them and knew very little about them.
But by accepting their friendships online, Katy could never have imagined the danger she was inviting into her life. In July 2011, 19-year-old Katy Briscoe was coming to the end of her first year studying an art foundation course at West Herts College in Watford. She had also begun seeing fellow student, 18-year-old Tony Bushby. But the couple kept their relationship secret.
Katy would talk about Tony Bushby to her friends, but would not go into details, and her friends knew very little about him.
Although Katy and Tony both seemed very secretive about their relationship, we do know that Katy had told one of her friends that she was in love with him.
You're always on that thing, Katy.
Katy didn't tell her family about her new boyfriend.
Are you okay?
I'm good.
And I kind of got the impression that there was somebody that she was seeing, but he was someone that she, for whatever reason,
5 minutes.
Okay.
didn't want to talk about.
Unbeknown to Katy's family, she not only had a secret boyfriend, but through Facebook, she was now friends online with 4 people he'd introduced her to.
The first person that Katy accepted a friend's request from was a guy called Dan Tress.
Are you the Katy that's going out with Tony?
Yeah?
I'm Dan. Has he not mentioned me?
Dan Tress introduced himself as a very good friend of Tony Bushby's to Katy and asked if she'd ever heard of him.
From some of the information on Facebook, there were certainly suggestions that Dan Tress was involved in criminal activity, including the use and supply of drugs.
Dan Tress begins to paint a different picture of Tony Bushby than Katy is probably aware of at the time.
And one of Tony's friends took a particular interest in his new girlfriend.
So how old are you?
Katy also befriended Cynthia Darwin, who was known as Sin. She was a 19-year-old female from Camden in London.
So got yourself an artist, have you?
It seemed Tony Bushby had been more than just friends with Sin Darwin in the past.
Throughout the messages, it is implied that they had a bit of an on-off relationship, a bit of history together.
Through their Facebook messages, it appeared Sin Darwin wanted to rekindle her romance with Tony Bushby.
No, not
Not for old time's
no,
sake.
I'm in a relationship with her.
But he was now with Katy, a relationship they had hidden from both their families. However, in the summer of 2011, Katy's big sister unintentionally met her secret boyfriend.
As I came downstairs, I saw Katy on the doorstep.
Hello.
I thought you were at work.
I finished early today.
I kind of just stood there, and she, at that point, had to introduce him to me because I hadn't moved.
Tony, this is my sister. Hello.
He'd come in, and he had sat at the bottom of my sofa underneath my window, and I felt uneasy by him, by his presence. And then I went back upstairs for about 2 minutes, and I came back downstairs and he was gone. And I found that to be very, very strange. Very rude, but also very, very strange.
And when Sabrina and Katy's mum, Joy, bumped into her youngest daughter's new boyfriend, she wasn't impressed either.
One day I was walking down the road in Boreham Wood and I saw this couple walking towards me, and I'm short-sighted, so I wasn't even aware it was Katy and this bloke until they got close to me. Then Katy waved and said, "Hi, Mum." Then this boy walked on a couple of steps and then he stopped. And this person, knowing who I was, he just walked off as though he had no respect. When I came back home, Katy was already indoors. So I said to her, "Who was that boy that you was with?"
He's a boy and he's a friend.
She clammed up and never answered any of their questions.
Tony Bushby had not made a good impression on Katy's family, and they were determined to find out more about her mystery boyfriend.
I became concerned. My questions became a bit more intrusive, and her answers became a bit more faint. I kind of didn't really get anywhere at all.
Meanwhile, Katy continued to talk online to the new friends she had met through Tony: Dan Tress, Sin Darwin, Shane Pluon, and Crystal Stangard.
The conversations that took place between that group of friends on Facebook were very much that they were involved in drinking, consuming drugs and living a party lifestyle. And Tony would distance himself from that type of lifestyle.
Oh, you used to love my wild ways.
Yeah, and then some of us changed. Some of us grew up.
The reason was all to impress Katy, and he didn't want her to think that he was involved in that sort of behaviour.
Katy had never met Tony's circle of friends in person. However, one in particular was desperate to meet her.
On the 9th of December, Sin Darwin sent a message to Katy in an attempt to organise a meeting between the three of them, Sin, Katy and Tony.
So, I've been trying to get Tony to agree to let me meet you, and he finally has, so when are you free? I am so looking forward to meeting you.
Sin Darwin seemed to have some sort of romantic history with Katy's boyfriend, and it seemed she was very keen to meet her replacement.
Sin, Tony and Katy arranged to meet on the evening of the 23rd of December at what I would describe as a remote, rural, wooded location.
But Sin Darwin went to great lengths to justify her unusual choice of meeting place.
Me and Tony usually go to this field. It's really near Boreham Wood, but it's really good because there's no one around and like the police don't bother you, so we can just make as much noise, have a laugh, have loads of fun, and it'll be really, really, really good.
Was Sin Darwin's motive for meeting Katy genuine, or did she have a more sinister agenda?
Dark, wooded, secluded. It is a very unusual place to be meeting socially.
On the 22nd of December, the final arrangements were made for the meeting.
We're meeting at 8:30. Katy, you can meet me at the...
The plan was in place, but just as she kept her relationship with Tony Bushby secret, neither did Katy tell her family about the meeting.
It was a Friday. We usually have a movie night where we would stay home, get a takeout.
How about Chinese tonight, Katy?
She had said to me not to order anything, and I had said to her, well, why not? What are we going to eat? And she'd said to me she's going out to a friend's house. So I had said to her, I'll drop you. Okay, then fine, I'll drop you.
No, it's okay, I'll just walk over.
Just randomly, I just said to her, I bet you're lying to me and you're going to see your boyfriend.
No.
And she went,
Michelle.
no, I'm not going to see my boyfriend. And then I go, I think you're meeting your boyfriend.
See you later.
Although she refused to confirm where she was really going, Katy left Sabrina's house and headed out to meet Tony as planned.
I'm sorry I'm late. Sabrina just kept going on and on. She knew I was going to meet you and she would not let it drop.
Doesn't matter. No, come on, let's get
I'm
going.
sorry.
No, it's fine, we're gonna be late, come on.
Katy and Tony headed to where the trio had agreed to meet, but when they arrived, there was no sign of Tony's ex-girlfriend.
Can you see her?
The couple waited in the cold December night, in the darkness.
She can't be too far off.
Sid! Responds a voicemail.
Katy?
The next morning when Sabrina woke up, Katy wasn't where she expected her to be.
She wasn't in bed. And I've come downstairs and I've seen her and she was lying on the sofa.
Katy. Hi. What are you doing down here?
She goes, oh, I came in and I was doing a bit of work on my laptop. Didn't think anything of it.
The reality was, Katy had been online, talking on Facebook.
I am so sorry, Katy. I am so stupid. You must hate me.
In the early hours of Christmas Eve morning, Sin and Katy exchanged messages where Sin explained that she hadn't been able to get to the meeting because she got lost,
I've been there hundreds of times and I didn't get there till 11 o'clock.
but that she's still very keen to meet and was hoping to rearrange the meeting for Christmas Eve itself.
We should definitely meet in a couple of weeks.
Katy could not meet Tony's enigmatic ex-girlfriend until the new year. In the meantime, she celebrated Christmas with her family.
Yeah, Christmas was a quiet one for us.
We had a lovely Christmas, our usual Christmas meal, trimmings and everything. We had a fantastic time.
It was a nice, quiet Christmas with all of us there.
The following day, Boxing Day, Sabrina had plans to go to London for the evening, and Katy jumped at the chance to babysit for her niece and nephew. Sabrina checked in with Katy just after 7 p.m.
Hi.
And I said to her, what are they doing? She said they're in bed. And I was like, oh, wow, you're good. I never had to worry. I didn't worry. I knew that they were safe in my house. I knew she was safe in my house. And I knew she wasn't going to go anywhere.
All right, I'll speak to you in a bit then. Bye.
But after that, Katy didn't answer her phone.
I didn't get hold of her, so now I'm aware that the children are sleeping. I am aware that she's at home. I'm aware that she's probably got her headphones on, which was nothing new, and that she just couldn't hear me. So I kept calling. I kept leaving answering machine messages on the phone.
Katy?
So she hadn't answered it, but I've been in this situation with Katy before and not been able to get in contact with her. So no real alarm bells rang through my head at that point. I had called my mum and said to my mum, you know what, Mum, I'm going back first thing in the morning, but just pop into the house and just make sure that everything's okay.
Katy's mum had been working on Boxing Day night, so as soon as her shift finished, she went to Sabrina's house.
I called round, and as I walked to the door, I noticed that there was blood stain on the outside of the door. I heard my two grandchildren say, Grandma, Katy's dead. Didn't want to alarm them, so I said, let Grandma in, without raising my voice, without showing panic. And they let me in. And they said, Katy's lying on the floor in the kitchen.
Katy? Katy?
But when I went to pick her up, she was cold. And I realized she was dead. I dialed 999 and they came around within minutes. I sort of expected them to say she was okay, we're going to take her to hospital. And they turned to me and they said, I'm sorry, we're a bit too late. And then I realized that she had gone. And my first thought was, I didn't even get to say goodbye to my daughter.
Katy had been brutally stabbed 23 times. One frightening fact was immediately clear. Katy must have known her killer. On Boxing Day 2011, 19-year-old Katy Briscoe was babysitting for her niece and nephew in Boreham Wood, Hertfordshire. When her mum called round early the following morning, she found her daughter's body in the kitchen. She had been stabbed 23 times.
I still expected them to say, we've made a mistake, you know, because I couldn't believe this was real. This was my beloved daughter that was killed like that.
Even when they were saying to me that my sister had been murdered, it still hadn't registered because I couldn't think who would want to hurt my sister.
However, the house, now a crime scene, immediately began to reveal telling clues about Katy's final moments and her killer.
There was no forced entry to the house, and there were no signs of any struggle or any assault or attack having taken place at or near to the front door. So whomever Katy had let into the house had followed her from the front door through the lounge and into the kitchen where the assault actually took place. It was that made it clear that this was somebody that Katy knew.
Katy, it seemed, had welcomed her killer into the house, and the police quickly understood the horror of what had happened once she had invited them in.
Katy suffered a sustained and frenzied assault at the hands of her attacker. She suffered multiple stab wounds, and to be honest, it's an image that will stay with me for the rest of my life.
Whilst the forensic team began to examine the crime scene and Katy's phone and computer were taken for analysis, CCTV also began to be viewed, and the police spoke to Katy's mum and sister to see if they could think of anyone who wanted to harm her.
There was nobody that I would have thought would have deliberately come in and hurt her. So for me, it was just like a whirlwind. You had to not like the person to have been capable to do what they did.
From talking to Katy's family, we were aware that she was in a relationship and had a boyfriend, although they weren't able to tell us a great deal about who the boyfriend was.
Are they quite serious?
From friends of Katy's that we spoke to, we were able to identify that Katy was in a relationship with Tony Bushby.
The couple had done everything they could to keep their relationship a secret, but the police now had a lead to follow up.
Initial police checks into Tony Bushby showed that he was not known to police and he had no criminal record. We were able to find an address for him, though.
Officers went to the 18-year-old's home to speak to him.
Hello? Does Tony Bushby live here?
When we first went to Tony Bushby's house, he was actually out and the only person in was his mum.
Why, is he okay?
As a matter of course, we asked her if she knew what he'd been doing the night before.
And then went out again?
She told them that Tony had gone out on the evening of the 26th, that he'd returned home around about 8:30 p.m. to pick up some ID so that he could go to the pub, and that he'd then gone out and returned home around about 10 p.m. The interesting aspect was she said that when he returned home at 10, he was in a really foul mood.
Thank you, Mrs. Bushby.
Because the officers hadn't spoken to Tony Bushby, they had to return to his house a short while later, and this time he was home.
Are you Tony Bushby?
Yeah. I said to him that I wanted to speak to him about Katy. We've been told that you were in a relationship with her, to which he said quite defensively, no, I'm not in a relationship with her.
No?
It occurred to me that being an 18-year-old lad, that Tony might not like discussing girlfriends in front of his mother, so I asked him to come to the local police station with me, where we could talk in private.
Thanks.
In the car, Tony confirmed that he did know Katy and that he'd spoken to her on the previous evening on the telephone whilst he had walked to a local supermarket, and that she was babysitting. He had then got home about 8:30 in the evening. This was obviously different to what his mum had told us.
So we had effectively a 90-minute window where we couldn't establish with any certainty where Tony Bushby was.
It appeared Tony Bushby had something to hide.
At no point prior to arriving at the police station did he ask actually why we were there or what had happened to Katy and why we wanted to know about her.
His behaviour on that journey caused the two officers some concern, and at that point, taking everything into consideration, the fact that Tony Bushby and Katy were in a relationship together, the fact that whoever murdered Katy had been let into the house willingly, and also the fact that Tony's mother had given an account which differed from the account that Tony was given to us, led us to declare Tony Bushby as a suspect for Katy's murder.
On the 27th of December 2011, at Hatfield Police Station, Tony Bushby was arrested on suspicion of Katy's murder.
Once Tony Bushby was booked into custody, his clothing was seized and a forensic examination was conducted of him. Outside of the police station, his address was sealed off for forensic examination as well.
The following morning, Tony Bushby said he needed to speak to an officer.
He made what we call a significant statement to me. He told me that he had lied to us the night before and that he'd been doing a friend a favour.
Is this going to get you into trouble?
The favour he had done would get both him and his friends in trouble. He then asked to speak to a solicitor before telling us anything else.
Come on, sunshine.
The question was, what was this secret? And who was Tony protecting? Later that day, on the 28th of December 2011, Tony Bushby formally confirmed what he'd said in the cells, with a prepared statement.
I hereby categorically confirm that I have absolutely no knowledge or awareness of any such murder whatsoever.
Tony Bushby was claiming that although he wasn't connected to Katy's murder, he was doing something illegal on the evening of Boxing Day 2011.
I have nothing further to add at this stage.
For the rest of the day, Tony Bushby refused to elaborate. However, at 10:30 that evening, he requested to speak to the police.
I want to tell you what really happened on that night.
It seemed Tony Bushby was ready to talk about what he'd been doing on the night of Katy's murder.
Tony Bushby stated that he'd been contacted on Christmas Day by a friend of his called Dan Tress, who had messaged him over Facebook live chat.
It appeared Dan Tress was not only a friend of Tony Bushby's, but was an online friend of Katy's and regularly exchanged messages with her.
Are you the Katy that's going out with Tony?
Yeah.
I'm Dan. Has he not mentioned me?
However, on Christmas Day, it was Tony Bushby he was talking to on Facebook.
Do you mind meeting up? I really want to ask a favour of you.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
He said that Dan Tress arrived and picked him up at about 7 o'clock in the evening on Boxing Day.
See ya.
He told his mum that he was going to the pub with another friend, as Tress had a bit of a bad reputation and he didn't want his mum to worry.
And in the car, Dan Tress lived up to that reputation.
He told me that the favour was I need to pick up some drugs for him.
Tony Bushby said that he had a think about it, but as Dan Tress had been a good friend to him in the past, he was prepared to basically take the risk and collect the drugs on his behalf. Dan Tress said that there was some spare time between them meeting and the actual scheduled time to pick the drugs up. So they began chatting about what they'd been doing at Christmas and what they'd been up to. After a while, Dan Tress turned the conversation towards Katy and had Tony Bushby spoken to Katy recently or called her.
Dan Tress suggested Tony Bushby should call his girlfriend.
Tony Bushby said that he then got out of the car and tried to telephone Katy, and he had quite a lengthy conversation with her.
I said hello.
It was at this point she told him that she was babysitting.
Babysitting?
And he told detectives Dan Tress seemed particularly interested by the fact that Katy was babysitting alone at her sister's house.
All night?
Then, Tony Bushby explained that Dan Tress suggested, because they had some time, they should go for a drink.
Tony says that he's not got his ID, so they returned to his home, popped into his house and grabbed his ID.
But Tony Bushby never made it to the pub.
They realised there wasn't enough time to go for a drink anyway, so Dan Tress took him to the location where he was meant to pick up the drugs from. He said he was then driven to a grassed area. Dan Tress showed him where the bench was.
Will you wait here for a bit? That's fine. We'll be back in about an hour.
Tress told him to wait there and the man would bring him the drugs, and he said that he would be back in an hour.
Dan Tress did not tell him where he was going. and Tony just waited at the park bench.
So I sat at the bench, about 20 minutes passed. I was sat with the drugs in my lap for about another 20 minutes, wondering where Dan was, and then he turned up.
Not too bad.
That stuff, yeah?
Yeah, it just came wrong as well.
Dan Tress then returned to the location and they went and got back in his car.
When Tony got back in the car, after 40 minutes waiting outside in the cold, his friend Dan Tress seemed grateful for his help.
Tony Bushby stated that Dan Tress looked at his hands and said, "Your hands look cold," and handed him a pair of gloves.
Put these on.
Cheers, man.
After a few seconds, he felt his hands getting wet, so took the gloves off. When he looked at his hands, he realised that he had blood on his hands.
Tony told detectives that Dan Tress's gloves were soaked in blood.
He was quite shocked to see this blood on his hand, so then threw the gloves in the footwell of the car.
What is this?
And he received no answer from Tress, who just looked straight ahead and drove him the short distance back to his house.
Dan Tress drove away, and Tony Bushby, with the blood still on his hands, ran into his house.
Just shut up and leave me alone.
Once he got home, he went straight upstairs and washed his hands in the upstairs sink.
Tony Bushby was now facing the realisation that he had inadvertently covered up the murder of his girlfriend.
It all seems to add up now, and I feel as though
Tony
Dan
Bushby said that since his arrest, he had been thinking about what had occurred on the evening of Boxing Day. And he actually thought that Dan Tress may have been responsible for what had happened to Katy.
Could Dan Tress be responsible for murdering Katy? The police were confident that Katy had known her killer, and it appeared that as well as being friends on Facebook for 6 months, Katy and Dan Tress had actually met in person.
Tony Bushby believed that Dan Tress had only met Katy once, and that was after he'd seen her in Boreham Wood and recognised her as being the girl in the picture on her Facebook profile, so had gone and introduced himself to her.
The police needed to find Dan Tress.
On the morning of the 29th, the investigation team were clearly briefed by me that locating Dan Tress was an absolute priority. The only information we had about Dan Tress was what was known from his Facebook profile, the fact that he was 19 years old and the fact that he came from London. So we set about trying to identify him from some of the various databases that are held, one, for example, being the voters' register. And what we were looking for was any trace of somebody by the name of Dan Tress.
And Tony Bushby gave as much information as he could about his friend to help track him down.
He described his car as a green VW Golf, although he wasn't able to give us the registration number. He also talked about how he'd met Dan Tress through their mutual interest in karate. So that presented us some other lines of inquiry.
The hunt was on to locate Dan Tress.
Despite the limited information Tony Bushby had given us, we still had some avenues that we could pursue around the names he had given us, Dan Tress's car, and also around meeting them at a karate club.
Oh, hello.
From every single check against every database that's held, there was no trace of anybody by the name of Dan Tress alive in the UK.
The detectives realised that Katy's killer must be right in front of them.
It transpired that Dan Tress didn't actually exist and that he was completely fictitious and made up by Tony Bushby.
As the idea of Dan Tress evaporated, so did the cloud of lies Tony Bushby had attempted to use to conceal the horrific truth. The police believed he was in fact Katy Briscoe's killer. And with that clarity, the full tangled web of lies became visible.
The 4 Facebook profiles for Dan Tress, Shane Pluon, Sin Darwin and Crystal Stangard had all been created on Tony Bushby's laptop whilst it was being operated from Tony Bushby's home address.
The disturbing reality was that these 4 friends were entirely fictitious. Characters created in Tony Bushby's bedroom with the sole purpose of manipulating Katy Briscoe.
But it's certainly my opinion that those 4 Facebook profiles were created with the sole intent of luring Katy into Tony's fantasy world and enabling him to groom Katy towards being able to commit this horrific crime.
This revelation put events leading up to Katy's murder in a new, sinister light, especially the evening of the 23rd of December. Sin Darwin and Katy arranged to meet in a remote location, but Sin Darwin didn't exist.
I don't know Bournemouth at all. So it's probably easier, Tony, if you show Katy where the place is and I'll just meet you there.
That meeting on the 23rd had been orchestrated and planned by Tony Bushby. And when you consider that he was looking to lure Katy to a remote, rural location when it would have been dark, I am firmly of the view that he was planning to murder Katy that evening.
And it appears that it was just pure chance that Katy unwittingly escaped Tony Bushby that night by telling him her sister had guessed she was going out to meet him.
Him being the coward that he is, he knew that that night was not the night.
Tony's desire to try and get away with murder meant Katy had one last Christmas with her family.
She knew I was going to meet you and she would not let it drop. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine, doesn't matter.
But it is clear that Tony Bushby remained determined to kill his girlfriend.
We were also able to recover from Tony Bushby's laptop certain searches that he had conducted in the days and weeks leading up to Katy's murder. And we know that he searched things like how to dispose of a body, how to burn a body, how to dig a grave.
Katy's brutal murder was clearly premeditated. The motive behind it would highlight Tony Bushby's most depraved and twisted fantasy yet. On Boxing Day 2011, 19-year-old Katy Briscoe was brutally murdered whilst babysitting. Her boyfriend, Tony Bushby, was arrested, but claimed his and Katy's Facebook friend, Dan Tress, had killed her.
I came to a very shocking conclusion that, I will be honest with you, I do not want to be true, but I do have my suspicions that Dan might be linked to this whole thing.
The police discovered Dan Tress and 3 other friends Bushby had introduced to Katy online were nothing more than figments of his twisted imagination. Tony Bushby had killed Katy.
We recovered CCTV footage from the morning of the 27th of December, and on that footage were images of Tony Bushby walking along the road carrying a large black bin bag. It's firmly my opinion that that black bin bag contained all of the clothing that Bushby was wearing when he murdered Katy, as well as the murder weapon itself. And despite extensive efforts to recover that bin bag, we unfortunately never did.
Despite denying killing Katy, Tony Bushby's web of lies was quickly unravelling.
Forensic scene examiners recovered some blood from the front door at Tony Bushby's home address. Whoever had left the blood there had had blood on their hands. Upon receiving the result from the laboratory that the blood found on Tony Bushby's front door was that of Katy Briscoe, that was absolutely the moment where we had sufficient evidence to seek a charging decision.
4 days after Katy was murdered, on the 30th of December 2011, Tony Bushby was charged and placed on remand. On the 5th of July 2012, the trial began at St Albans Crown Court. Tony Bushby pleaded not guilty.
We could categorically demonstrate that everything he was putting forward in his defence was a lie, but he still got up and gave evidence and stuck to that account.
He stood there and he made the comment of who would want to hurt Katy. Too right, who would want to hurt Katy, but he did.
The prosecution revealed a calculated, chilling, premeditated murder. After the failed murder attempt on the evening of the 23rd of December 2011, Tony Bushby did not waste any time in putting into motion his plan B.
Hey Katy, I've been thinking I really need to speak to you or meet up with you, say Boxing Day. Can I call you?
And in fact, they did make an arrangement to speak around 8 p.m on Boxing Day.
After speaking to Katy on the phone on the evening of the 26th of December 2011, he returned home at 8:30, just as his mother had recalled. However, he was not there to collect ID.
We believe that he returned home at about 8:30 to collect a knife, which he would use to attack her with, knowing that she was at home alone.
He then left his home address. We know there's a short telephone call to Katy shortly after 9 p.m. I would suggest that that short phone call is Tony Bushby checking to make sure that Katy is still alone and that the coast is clear for him to come around.
Once inside, that's when he attacked her and took full advantage of her being by herself.
And then we know that he's back home around 10, and from his mother's own description that he was in a foul mood.
Once he had returned home, he searched on the internet how to delete your Facebook profile, but was unsuccessful. So what he did was archive any messages between himself and Katy. The following morning, he disposed of the clothing and weapon used in the bin bag.
The horrific reality of what Tony Bushby had done to Katy was undeniable. For over 6 months, he had manipulated the 19-year-old and convinced her to keep their relationship secret so that when he committed his monstrous crime, there was nothing to connect them. But one mystery remained: Tony Bushby's motive for murder.
I was always satisfied from day one that this crime was sexually motivated, despite the fact that we did establish that Katy wasn't actually sexually assaulted. It is very well documented that some people actually gain sexual gratification from inflicting sharp injuries, and indeed the judge in his sentencing confirmed that he was absolutely satisfied that this had been a sexually motivated crime.
Tony Bushby's online activity immediately before and after the murder on the 26th of December supported this theory.
Tony Bushby had been viewing and searching for pornographic material prior to committing the offence. One disturbing aspect of that was that at the same time as searching for this material and viewing this material, he would also be looking at Katy's Facebook profile and sending her messages.
The websites were all of rape, submissive black girls, forced rape on black girls. I was totally shocked.
And in fact, having returned home after murdering Katy, Tony was viewing pornographic material within an hour or two of being back at home.
The way Katy was attacked, combined with the times at which Tony Bushby viewed the rape pornography, terrifyingly implies that Katy's killer did not just have murder on his mind.
I remember calling the phone several times and leaving messages, so I know that my voice was heard throughout that house.
Katy, would you just pick up the phone?
The motive was definitely sexual. And I just thank God every day that that one thing that he may have gone with the intention to do to my sister never ever happened.
On the 24th of July 2012, Tony Bushby was found guilty of the murder of Katy Briscoe. He was sentenced to life imprisonment to serve a minimum of 25 years.
He has no remorse. And he's taken one of the most loveliest people you'll ever meet's life. For what? I look at him with utter contempt.
From prison in 2013, Tony Bushby asked to see the police to confess to his crime and apologise to Katy's family. But when the police interviewed him, it seemed the murderer was once again playing twisted games.
He didn't provide any information about how or why, and suggested that he'd actually committed the crime at a time when he'd blacked out. It's a bit lame to suggest that you want the family to know that you're feeling that remorse, but then not give them the answers that they want.
Can he give us her back? Will she ever be back? So why should we ever forgive him?
I think Tony Bushby is a very dangerous individual, and that everybody is much safer because he's behind bars.
While Bushby faces living most of his adult life behind bars, Katy's family has to cope with her loss every day.
I will never ever understand it, but at the same time, I have to and have learnt to be strong.
There was times when I felt I've been asleep for 2 years, and I wish someone would just wake me up and tell me that I've been having a nightmare, and I'll be so grateful to that person, because I can't accept the fact that she has been taken away from me.